Thank you for joining me today for Mandala Monday. Today we'll be creating a mandala using the jeweled leaves black and white templates with the frog color palette. So this is the collection of papers within the frog collection, and we'll be using the oranges, yellows, and greens to create this beautiful mandala. We'll also be creating a canvas with all of our scraps after we cut out the shapes, and we'll be able to use that to add some doodles just as we did last week with the Teal Tango collection. So let's get started. The first thing that I want to do is to cut my shapes into 4 sections, and I'm using my paper trimmer. And if you don't have a paper trimmer, you can use a large pair of scissors. And then the next thing I like to do is to cut these clusters of shapes out. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4 different shapes, and I like to just go ahead and separate them. I'll do these off camera, but I'll do the exact same thing. And then the next step is to cut the shapes on the outside of the black line. So you want to go on the outside so that it fits the mandala template. And I like to keep this background scrap all in one piece. So I'll just maneuver around. Cutting shape by shape, keeping the background intact. So just like that. So keeping that background intact. Now, if this is difficult for you to do, then it's fine. You don't have to do it like that. But what I end up doing is I most often will glue them all back together on a sheet of white paper, and then we'll add some doodles on the white part on this piece of paper. So for the smaller pieces, it could be a little bit more difficult. So if it's not enjoyable to you to try to keep that in one piece, then certainly you can cut it in pieces, however you'd like to do it, whatever's easiest. You'll still be able to most likely put them together on this sheet, or you can just use those little scraps as collage fodder. But I'm going to go ahead and cut out all of my shapes off camera, and then I'll be back. All right, so I'm back with all of my mandala shapes cut out, and they're ready to be placed on the mandala. And just so you know, there's enough shapes here to create 4 mandalas. So there's 3 other painted papers in this collection, so you could print those as well. I typically, I shift. Sometimes I do one, sometimes I do more. With my leftover shapes, if I'm not going to do any more mandalas, I'll use those for collage fodder, maybe use them around the borders. And then here I have all of the backgrounds intact, so I'll end up gluing that down to this piece of paper here. But I'm going to set that aside, and the next step is laying out the shape. So I'm going to just come up with a design using these. These yellow ones are the same, so I probably won't use them unless I decide to overlap them, which ends up looking really cool, overlapping the yellow with any of these. So what I'll do now is I'll just try them out in different ways, and then we'll take a look at what I have. So this is looking really nice to me as it is. With any of the mandalas that have an even number of shapes, so here there's 6, I could do every other a different design, which I sometimes like to do. So I'll test that out as well. And I'm liking that as it is now. So we'll do every other one for these larger ones. I'm going to move these to the side. And then the next step is gluing down the shapes to the mandala. So I'm going to organize these in a container. I like to use these plastic containers, so I'll just place them all in there. These smaller ones can be harder to pick up, so I'll typically take one of the larger shapes and then just scoop them up. And I'll set that aside and move this over. So the materials I'll need now is my Mod Podge and my Mod Podge brush. So the small brush, and then I have a large brush. And then what I like to do is simply move these aside. And then I'll go ahead and glue these down shape by shape. What I like to do is put the Mod Podge there, putting enough down so that this slides a little bit, but not too much. If I use too much Mod Podge, which I did last week, it does tend to buckle more. So I want to do a balance between enough to be able to slide it, but not too much so that I'm really coating it thick and the paper curls up. The alternative would be I'm going to grab a scrap piece of chipboard here, which is like cardboard. I could glue the back of this and then place it on so that there's less likely to be a lot of Mod Podge on there. I just find that trickier to do it that way with the smaller pieces. So maybe the larger pieces, I'll do it like that. And then for the smaller pieces, maybe do it this way. I could also try to soak up some of that excess so there's not so much down there. When I'm doing my brush strokes, I do try to do them in the same direction. So no matter what shape I'm doing them up and down instead of some sideways. Sometimes you can see the strokes when the Mod Podge is dry. I don't find that so much with the matte. With the glossy I do, but I just try to get in that habit of doing it all in one direction. So right now I'm trying to lift off some of the excess, but we are going to be coating the entire surface. So I'm going to use a large brush for that. And I want enough to coat the entire surface. So I'm working on my silicone mat here. So enough to coat it, but not too much, because we want to try to minimize the curling of the paper. Okay. So I'm going to lift this off so it doesn't stick. I'm going to wash off my, well, before I do that, why don't I go ahead and glue these down the same way. I'm going to move them aside. Then with my large brush, I'm going to apply the Mod Podge here. and then piece by piece, place them down and fit them back together like a puzzle. Okay, so I pieced it all together. I alternated between my small and large brush. I had some difficulty in areas when I didn't put enough Mod Podge down because I couldn't slide the pieces around, but for the most part, everything came back together real nice. I'm just going to lift this up, make sure it's not sticking down, and then the last thing I want to do is coat the entire surface. So we want to seal the paper. The Mod Podge also brings out the brilliance of the colors in the printed paper. That's another benefit. So I'll just go ahead and coat the entire surface. Okay, so now what I want to do is I don't want my brushes to dry out. I'm going to cap my Mod Podge container. So I have a top that has a hole cut out so that my brush can slide in. And then for my large brush, I need to find my plastic wrap and I'll wrap that up. Since at this point, I'm not sure if I'm going to be using the Mod Podge again, I'm gonna do this so that it will be ready for me if I do want to use it. I'm going to go ahead and move this aside and I'm going to clean my workspace. Always keeping a wet and dry cloth nearby to keep my hands and my workspace clean. Okay, I'm back with both the mandala and then the scraps all dry. And I actually put these in my printer bed and closed the cover, and that was to help them flatten out after they were dry. So I let the Mod Podge dry, put them in the printer, and then took them out after a couple hours. So what I'm going to do now, let's take a look at the color wheel again for the frog collection. And we've got our greens, yellows, and oranges. So I took out my acrylic markers within this color palette. I also grabbed a black and a white. What we'll be doing today is adding some doodles to this mandala. And here I have the guided doodling sheets from the last 3 weeks. And here we've played around with different marks. For this one, there's lines and circles. We practice connecting the shapes with different marks. Here we've got our triangles and our dots, and this is a very beautiful pattern. I'm loving this. So these are all ideas that I can use when I'm doing my mandala and also adding doodles to the scraps here. And then this one has the squares and the spirals. So I'm going to put these off to the side, but I want to make sure that I can peek at them as I'm adding the doodles to the mandala. I'll take this sheet out. I want to center this. So these are all extra fine point acrylic markers. I have a scrap piece of paper. This is so I can test out the markers. This does have a layer of Mod Podge on it. I have an extra white pen. The other things I like to have are a jar of water, some cotton swabs. This is just in case I mess up. As long as the acrylic marker's still wet, I can dip my cotton swab in the water and then rub it off. And then I also have some baby wipes. That's to clean off the tips of the markers and, if I need to, my hands. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. What I want is to be able to turn this paper, so I don't want the markers in my way. I'll move them off to the side there. This is okay, but I want to make sure that I have some movement because as I'm doodling, I'm going to keep my drawing hand steady and then I'll be turning the mandala. What I typically like to start with is my black marker, so I'm going to go ahead and shake it. And then I'm going to test it. Just want to make sure that it's flowing nice and smooth, which it is. And then I typically start with the center. And again, when I look at this, we have all the shapes of the jeweled leaves mandala. So we're doing the jeweled leaves mandala on the frog paper. And I can take a look at all these designs that I did. So here we have the centerpiece here. We have these large leaf shapes here, and then these two shapes here and here. So that's why I love doing that guided doodling. It's a non-pressure way to just come up with ideas and create a doodle library. So I'm going to go ahead and starting at the middle, and just see where my hand leads me. So I tested my marker, but now it's not, there it goes. So just getting into a relaxed flow. Some of the ideas I may pull from the doodle sheet, but more likely they're just going to be coming from my mind as I go. And the center's complete, and then I'm going to just move on to the other shapes. Again, keeping my drawing hand steady and then rotating the paper. This way I'm not reaching across and smudging anything. Okay, so I've created some doodles within all of the shapes. The next thing that I like to do is look for connections between the shapes. So just like we did on the the guided doodling, I'm going to consider ways to connect the shapes here. And just being careful not to smudge any of the marks that aren't dry. Okay, so this is looking really nice and connected. I did all of the doodles to connect those shapes. And then the last thing I want to consider is if I want to do any doodles outside of the shape. So is there anything else that I want to add to some of the outside? So maybe up here, just adding some more marks and doodles. Okay, so I'm done with the black. I've doodled inside the shapes, between them, and then outside. And then typically I like to move on to my white marker. That adds a really nice contrast to the colors in the black. So I'm going to go ahead and test my marker and then look for areas that I want to add white. Okay, so I'm finished with my white marker. I'm going to go ahead and cap it. And now I want to take one of my other markers within the color palette and I'm going to go ahead with the orange. So opening it, and I do want to test it. And then look for areas that I want to add the orange. Again, being careful not to smudge any of the areas that I just painted with the markers. Okay, so I'm just scanning it and I feel like I'm done with the orange marker and I'm going to go ahead and grab the orange yellow, shaking it and then testing it. And then looking for any areas that I want to add this color. So here I'm having a little bit of difficulty with this marker. At first it wasn't really coming out, and then it ended up coming out in a big glob, so I washed it off. So I'm just cleaning the tip and seeing if I can get this to work. And I might end up moving on to another color, even though I used that partially. I'm going to go ahead and get my Q-tip again and wash that area up, and it's pulled some of the white off too and the black, but I'll be able to redo those. And I'm going to go ahead and move on to another color. This is a light yellow. And I'm thinking of going over some of that yellow orange that I just did. And then just scanning it and moving on to my next color. I think I'll go with this light green. This is a little bit lighter than any of the greens within that, but it's pretty similar to some of the light greens in some of the other collage papers in this collection. So I'm going to go ahead Ooh, and I'm really feeling like that light green was a nice addition to add a little bit of variation there. And what I'm doing now is just scanning. I'm going to decide if there's any other colors I want to add. I'm actually thinking of grabbing the green again. I wanted to try some dots here. Okay, so at this point I'm feeling done. I'm really enjoying the color combination. You can add as much or as little detail as you'd like when you do these mandalas. I could perhaps go back later and do some more, but at this point I'm done. For this one, I'm going to keep this as a master. I want to use it for some inspiration, I don't think I'm going to be framing it. I may, but let's take a look. So this would make a really nice framed piece if I decided to go that way. I could look at some of these papers and think of a border that I might want to do along the edges. So I could print out one of the full sheets, or a half sheet would probably be enough, and see if I want to add a border. In week 1, we glued this down to a piece of stretch canvas and added a border, so you can go back and take a look at that. But at this point, I'm going to call this session complete. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next video.